What is up, guys? Dzeeff here, and I didn't think I would play this deck so soon after quitting it a few months back, but I'm here playing Madolches. I took this deck to locals last night. My only loss was in the final round to time, unfortunately, but I think this deck actually is a very good rogue deck right now. I think it has a ton of potential. Admittedly, we're kind of in a transitional period right now. We have Synchro Storm today, and then next week we have Burst of Destiny, but I still think this deck is going to have a lot of potential in the upcoming months. Madolche can use Crossout Designator quite well. It's one of the best new cards for this deck. I know Crossout has gone down in price because people aren't really playing it at the moment. I think right now it's $50, which is crazy to think about. The pre-sales on that card were $120, but regardless, I think Madolche can play Crossout quite well. This deck doesn't really lose to Nibiru that much as I thought it did a few months ago. You can simply make a more conservative play on turn 1 to play through Nibiru, but this deck does happen to lose against hand traps like Ash and Imperm and Veiler, especially if your opponent knows what your deck does. So I think that Crossout is specifically good in this deck because it can lose to so many different hand traps, not just Nibiru. I will say I was a bit rusty with this deck. While the opening combos are pretty straightforward, this deck can get into a pretty complicated game state with a ton of effects available, and I wasn't always perfect with my sequencing, which is a very important part of playing this deck, so I hope to get better with that in the future. If this video inspires you guys to buy a Madolche deck or buy any of the cards that I talk about in today's video, please use my link to tstplayer.com. It'll be in the description below. Anyway, we have 3 copies of Mageline, of course, 3 copies of Petting Cessor, 3 copies of Angeline. My Madolche ratios are not too crazy here, so I'll go through kind of fast. 2 copies of Hoot Cake, 2 copies of Messenger Gelato, and 1 copy of Pudding Cess. All of that is pretty standard. I think most people know about those ratios if you've tried to play the deck. So for the hand traps, I played 3 copies of Dimensional Shifter. The other hand traps are in here for Crossout, but D-Shifter is just a great card in this deck. You can do so much with this card. You can add it back to your hand with the Glass Souffle if you have Chateau on the board. That's pretty crazy. You can banish it for Hoot Cake if you do it turn 1. This card is fantastic in Madolches. I really like it, so that is definitely a big reason to play this deck. For the Crossout hand traps, we played 1 copy of Ash Blossom, 1 copy of Veiler, 1 copy of Nibiru, and 1 copy of Infinite Impermanence. So I think all of these cards are pretty darn good against Madolche. Like I said, turn 1 I play around Nibiru, but sometimes when you're like comboing off on turn 2 when you're trying to OTK, they can still hit you with a Nibiru, so I still think it's good to play in the main deck. And maybe at like a bigger event where people aren't main decking Nibiru, I wouldn't care as much, but at locals, you never know what you're going to play against. A lot of people still do main deck Nibiru, so I think it is good in the main deck for Crossout. But I think that Ash, Veiler, and Impermanence are the big ones here. These cards can be crippling to your combos, especially if your opponent knows what to stop. So I think that's why Crossout is so good in this deck. You want to have a way to stop those types of cards on your big effects. So this worked out pretty well. This was the first event I've actually, I mean, it's not like a huge event, but this is the first event that I've taken Crossout to, and it was really good. I stopped multiple copies of Ash Blossom. I believe I stopped an Impermanence, and that was only in just a few rounds at a local tournament. So I think Crossout in this deck actually was as good as I expected it to be. For the spell cards, we have 3 copies of Salon, of course. I see some people playing 2 of this. I don't understand it. I get that you can search it, but I think that this is like one of the best cards to open up when you're going second and trying to break boards. I think 3 is very good in this deck. 1 copy of Chateau and 1 copy of Ticket. Why is this card still only a common? I have no idea, but yeah, these are just the cards that you don't super want to draw. Sometimes I guess you can lose if your opponent like Cosmics the 1 copy of Chateau, but I think it's fine at 1 copy per deck. I've never really found myself needing a second copy. So I will say here with the last Madolche deck, I actually ended up selling my Pot of Prosperities because I didn't think I would play them at anything else, and I kind of didn't want to play Madolche anymore. So when I went to locals, I had 3 copies of Extravagance in here instead of Prosperities, but I remembered that the previous week they actually had a few Pot of Prosperities for sale, but they only had 2 for sale, so I actually played 2 copies of Prosperity and 1 copy of Extravagance. You should play, if you can, if you already own the card, 3 copies of Pot of Prosperity in the this deck. It is crazy good. It's not like you're super worried about banishing a 3-of with Extravagance. That doesn't happen that often, but I think just having the ability to dig for specific cards is really good in this deck. You have a number of great 1-card combos, so Prosperity is great, and it can also dig for side deck cards a lot better than Extravagance can. So yeah, definitely play 3 Prosperity if you have them, but my locals only had 2 for sale, so I played 2 and then 1 copy of Extravagance, which admittedly looks pretty silly. So for the anti-hand trap stuff, this is the same as our B Trooper decks. We have 3 copies of Crossout, 2 copies of Tactics, and 1 copy of Called by the Grave. I almost want to put Tactics to 3 copies per deck. This card was really good when I drew it, and I almost wished I drew it more. I mean, it was so strong. There were a lot of hands that I had Crossout and Tactics, and if my opponent hand trapped me, I mean, I was so far ahead at that point that it was basically an instant win. I think these cards are great in this deck. It's a really big difference because the last time I played this deck, I think I only had Called by the Grave. I didn't own Tactics, and Crossout wasn't out. So going from 1 way to interact with hand traps to 6 ways, that's a pretty noticeable difference. And I really like these cards over Herald of the Orange Light. That card was really inconsistent for me. I think these ones are a lot better in my opinion. I'm sure people will still play Orange Light, but for me, it just never quite worked out the way I wanted it to. For the trap cards, we had 2 copies of Promenade, 1 copy of Knights. I put this in at the last second, like right before locals. This was the 41st card. I think it's good, mainly because if you open Promenade or your Salon and you still have your regular combo, you'll have like an extra search, and while you can go for Ticket or Chateau, I think just going for the extra negation with Knights can be pretty strong. And then finally, we have 3 copies of Solemn Strike. I think this card is great in this deck. It can help you break boards sometimes, but also it makes your turn 1 a lot better. This isn't really a control deck. You're not going to main deck other trap cards, but I think Strike is very good right now. For the extra deck, we played 3 copies of Queen Tiramisu, 3 copies of Glass Souffle, 3 copies of a la Mode, 3 copies of Sistart, and then for the 3 flex spots, I think you can run a number of different cards. These were just the 3 that I played the last time I was using Madolches. So I had 1 copy of Dweller, 1 copy of Levier, and 1 copy of Underworld Goddess. Levier is a card that I think people don't really use anymore, but I find it pretty helpful in this deck sometimes. You can get in some awkward situations where you control 2 level 3s, and Levier can sometimes help you in those weird situations. So the extra deck is pretty straightforward. Like I said, these 3 spots can be a number of different things. Maybe next time I would play Zeus. That card's kind of interesting. It's kind of hard to make these cards because if you use the Petty Ancestor effect to special from deck, you're locked into Madolche monsters, but they come up every once in a while, I guess, so it's worth mentioning that there are other cards that you can try out, like Zeus, for example. I'll quickly show the side deck here. I just kind of threw it together, but we had 3 copies of Gamma Seal and 2 copies of Chalice for going second against the combo decks. Keep in mind that when you go second against combo decks, you also have those 7 hand traps for main decking as well. You probably wouldn't keep the crossouts in when going second, but you can keep in the hand traps if they're good in that specific matchup. I really hate back row decks with this deck, so I just played a ton of back row removal. 3 copies of Cosmic, 2 copies of Twin Twisters, 1 Duster, and 1 Red Reboot. These cards just allow you to OTK. This deck is quite good when it is able to actually play the game, so you want to destroy those floodgates. I kind of got locked out by Rivalry of Warlords a couple times, and these cards came in clutch. The final card that you guys probably already saw there was 3 copies of a Pointer. I love this card. This is probably like one of my favorite side deck cards in the entire game. When I do this card going first, it was insane, so I like a Pointer quite a bit in a lot of decks, but especially decks that are able to OTK the opponent. In Altergeists, you Pointer them to stun them and then combo off on your next turn, not really to OTK, but to set up an unbreakable board. In this deck, though, you are trying to Pointer to stop your opponent's combo, and then on your next turn, you are in fact trying to OTK with your regular Madolche combos. Anyway, that is all for today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I think Madolche are very good in the upcoming format as a rogue contender. They're not going to be a meta deck anytime soon, but they do have a number of great tools at their disposal. I'll see you guys later. Thanks so much for watching. Goodbye.